Hello everyone, and welcome to my YNR Official 24 channel. Daniel Romalotti Jr. had changed everything, and as the hum of Genoa city life buzzed outside the window, Tessa's mind raced with 1,000 questions she wasn't ready to answer. How could she tell him? Should she tell him? And what would this mean for the life she had built with Mariah Copeland, the woman who believed their future was finally solid after years of trauma, loss, and hard-won trust? While across town, fate was already tightening its grip, because secrets in Genoa City never stay buried for long, and the universe seemed determined to make sure this one detonated with maximum damage. As Tessa tried to convince herself that this pregnancy didn't have to define her, didn't have to destroy everything, even as guilt crept in like a shadow she couldn't outrun, reminding her that Daniel wasn't just anyone. He was a man with his own complicated history, his own regrets, his own unresolved ties. And the thought of his reaction, shock, disbelief, responsibility, or worse, indifference, made her stomach churn almost as much as the morning sickness she'd been trying desperately to hide. Yet unbeknownst to her, the real storm was already gathering in the hallway outside, where Mariah, returning early from a last-minute Crimson Lights meeting, slowed her steps when she heard Tessa's muffled voice through the slightly ajar door, speaking on the phone in a hushed, frantic whisper that instantly set off Mariah's internal alarm, because when you love someone the way Mariah loved Tessa, you recognize fear in their voice even before the words register. And as Mariah paused, just for a second, telling herself she shouldn't eavesdrop, that trust meant privacy, she heard the sentence that would slice straight through her heart like glass. I don't know how to tell Daniel. Yes, it's his. I'm pregnant. And in that moment, the world seemed to tilt on its axis, as Mariah's breath caught in her throat, her hand instinctively bracing against the wall to keep from collapsing, every memory of abandonment, betrayal, and being second choice flooding back with brutal clarity, because this wasn't just about a baby, it was about a lie, about a moment when Tessa had turned to someone else instead of her, about a future Mariah thought was there suddenly sprouting roots she had no claim to. And as she stood there frozen, tears blurring her vision, she continued to overhear fragments of the conversation, Tessa insisting she never meant for this to happen, that she still loved Mariah, that this didn't change her feelings, words that somehow made the pain worse, not better, because love mixed with deception had always been Mariah's breaking point. And by the time Tessa hung up the phone and leaned against the sink, unaware she'd been overheard, Mariah had already made the first quiet, fateful decision to walk away without confronting her, because anger hadn't arrived yet, only devastation, the kind that calcifies into something dangerous when left alone too long. While hours later, Daniel sat in his penthouse studio staring at unfinished sketches, unaware that his life was about to collide violently with Tessa's secret, replaying that night in his head with the hazy guilt of a man who knew he'd crossed a line but convinced himself it had meant nothing, just a moment of weakness fueled by loneliness and too much honesty, never suspecting that moment had left a permanent mark. And when Tessa finally did show up, pale and visibly shaken, Daniel barely had time to ask what was wrong before she blurted it out, tears spilling as she told him she was pregnant and that the baby was his, a confession that hit him like a freight train, knocking the air from his lungs as he struggled to process the implications: fatherhood, responsibility, Mariah, Heather, Lucy, the press, his family name. While Tessa rushed to clarify she wasn't asking for anything, didn't want to disrupt his life, just needed him to know. But Daniel, despite his shock, surprised even himself by responding with quiet resolve, insisting he wouldn't abandon his child, that he would step up no matter what, words that were meant to be reassuring but would soon echo painfully in Mariah's mind when she learned of them, because by then Mariah wasn't just heartbroken, she was spiraling, replaying every moment of her relationship with Tessa, questioning what was real and what had been a lie. And when Sharon noticed her daughter's distant eyes and brittle smiles, it didn't take long for the truth to surface, though Mariah carefully edited it, admitting she'd overheard something she wasn't meant to hear and that it had changed how she saw everything, while Sharon, sensing the depth of her pain, urged her to slow down, to talk to Tessa, to not let assumptions harden into regret, But Mariah had already crossed an emotional point of no return, because the idea of raising someone else's child, Daniel's child, while constantly being reminded of the night Tessa chose someone else felt unbearable, and instead of confronting Tessa honestly, Mariah chose silence, a decision that would soon turn cruel, as she began to emotionally withdraw, offering vague excuses, canceling plans, and quietly preparing an exit strategy that felt like self-preservation in her fractured mind but would read as calculated punishment to everyone else, while Tessa, sensing the growing distance, became increasingly desperate, convinced Mariah somehow knew but terrified to ask outright, her anxiety peaking as morning sickness worsened and her pregnancy became harder to hide, and when she finally tried to open up, to explain that something was wrong and she needed support, Mariah deflected with cold politeness, her warmth replaced by a detached calm that hurt far more than anger would have, and in the midst of this emotional stalemate, Genoa city gossip began to stir, because secrets have a way of leaking through the cracks, especially when Phyllis Summers catches a whiff of scandal, and once she pieced together that Daniel might be involved with Tessa in a way that went far beyond friendship, it was only a matter of time before whispers turned into headlines, forcing Mariah to confront not just personal betrayal but public humiliation, and that was when her pain hardened into something sharper, more ruthless, because if Tessa could rewrite their future, without her consent, Mariah decided she would take control of the narrative in the only way she knew how, by making a decision that would ensure Tessa could never fully reclaim what they once had, and that decision came quietly, without dramatics, when Mariah accepted a long-term job offer out of town, one she'd previously turned down because it would mean leaving Tessa behind, signing the contract without telling her, packing her bags while Tessa was at a recording session, and leaving behind only a note that said she needed space and time to heal. A move that gutted Tessa when she returned home to find their apartment half empty, Mariah gone, and no chance to explain, apologize, or fight for them, because Mariah's cruelty wasn't loud or vindictive. It was the cold denial of closure, the kind of punishment that lingers, and as Tessa crumpled to the floor clutching her stomach, whispering apologies to both the baby and the woman she loved, Daniel found himself unexpectedly pulled deeper into her orbit, offering support, doctor visits, and steady reassurance, unaware that his involvement only reinforced Mariah's worst fears, and though Daniel tried to keep things strictly about the baby, lines blurred, emotions tangled, and Genoa City watched as alliances shifted and loyalties fractured, while Mariah, miles away, pretended she was fine, telling herself that leaving was the only way to survive, even as loneliness gnawed at her, because deep down she knew her decision wasn't just about protecting herself. It was about punishing Tessa for a betrayal she couldn't forgive, and as months passed and the pregnancy progressed, the weight of unspoken truths threatened to crush everyone involved, setting the stage for explosive confrontations, shattered relationships, and the haunting question that would linger long after the baby was born. Was Mariah's cruel decision an act of self-respect, or the moment she let her pain destroy the love she still desperately wanted to believe in? The silence Mariah left behind did not fade with time but instead grew louder, echoing through every corner of Genoa City as Tessa struggled to function in a world that suddenly felt hollowed out, waking each morning to an empty apartment and an ache that sat heavier than the nausea twisting her stomach, because the absence of Mariah was not just emotional but physical, a missing presence that lingered in forgotten coffee mugs, half-written songs, and the quiet moments when Tessa instinctively turned to speak only to remember there was no one there to listen, and as her pregnancy advanced and her body changed, the isolation became unbearable, forcing her to confront the reality that she was preparing to bring a child into the world while the woman she loved had chosen disappearance over confrontation, a truth that cut deeper than any accusation could have, while Daniel, increasingly aware of the fragile emotional state Tessa was in, found himself torn between wanting to be supportive and fearing that his involvement was unintentionally erasing Mariah from the picture altogether, a fear that intensified when Sharon cornered him at Crimson Lights, her eyes sharp with maternal concern as she demanded to know exactly what role he intended to play in Tessa's life, making it clear that while she appreciated his willingness to step up as a father, She would not tolerate him exploiting Mariah's pain or rewriting history to suit his own conscience, words that rattled Daniel and forced him to acknowledge the uncomfortable truth that no matter how honorable his intentions were now, they could never undo the damage already done, especially as Phyllis, ever the accelerant, began dropping barely disguised hints to anyone who would listen that a major scandal was brewing, ensuring that whispers about Tessa's pregnancy and Daniel's involvement spread faster than facts, turning private anguish into public spectacle. And when Lily confronted Daniel directly, demanding honesty, not as an ex, but as someone who understood the cost of secrets, Daniel finally admitted how overwhelmed he felt, confessing that he didn't know whether he was doing the right thing or simply reacting to guilt, because every time he tried to draw boundaries, Tessa looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and heartbreak that made him feel responsible for more than just a child, while Tessa herself oscillated between fierce independence and crushing vulnerability, insisting she didn't need saving. Even as she leaned on Daniel for stability, creating a dynamic that neither of them fully understood, especially as the baby became more real with every ultrasound, every flutter of movement reminding Tessa that no matter how complicated her love life had become, she was no longer making decisions for herself alone. And yet despite all the chaos in Genoa City, the most brutal reckoning was unfolding miles away, where Mariah sat alone in a rented apartment in another city, surrounded by boxes she hadn't bothered to unpack, telling herself she was free while replaying Tessa's voice in her head over and over again, because distance did not dull the pain the way she'd hoped. It sharpened it, stripping away distractions until she was left alone with her choices, haunted by the knowledge that she hadn't just walked away to heal but had deliberately chosen the path that would hurt Tessa the most, denying her the chance to explain, to fight, to prove that the betrayal wasn't the end of their love. And as Mariah threw herself into work, accepting long hours and isolating assignments, she became the picture of success on the outside while unraveling privately, her nightmares filled with images of Tessa giving birth without her, of Daniel stepping into a role that should have been hers, of a child growing up never knowing the woman who could have loved them unconditionally if only she'd been brave enough to stay. And when Sharon finally tracked her down, refusing to accept silence as an answer, the confrontation was explosive, Sharon accusing her daughter of confusing self-protection with self-destruction, of turning pain into punishment, while Mariah lashed out in defense, insisting that staying would have destroyed her, that watching Tessa raise Daniel's child would have been a daily reminder of her own expendability. And though Sharon listened, her final words lingered long after she left, reminding Mariah that cruelty disguised as boundaries had a way of coming back around, especially when unfinished love was involved. Meanwhile, back in Genoa City, the pressure mounted as Tessa's pregnancy became impossible to hide, forcing her to finally confirm the truth publicly, a moment that sent shockwaves through the community and drew inevitable comparisons and judgments, with some praising her strength and others quietly questioning her choices. And as the scrutiny intensified, Tessa cracked in private moments, confessing to Daniel that she felt like she'd lost everything: her partner, her sense of identity, her faith in herself. And though Daniel reassured her that she wasn't alone, the reassurance rang hollow because it wasn't Mariah's voice she wanted to hear. And when complications during a routine checkup landed Tessa in the hospital overnight, fear sliced through everyone involved, including Mariah, who learned about it through a late-night phone call and found herself shaking uncontrollably at the thought that she might lose Tessa without ever having said goodbye, forcing her to confront the reality that her decision, however justified it once felt, had not erased her love but merely buried it under layers of pride and fear. And as Tessa lay in that hospital bed staring at the ceiling, hand resting protectively over her stomach, she whispered apologies to the child for the chaos surrounding their arrival, promising that she would do better, that she would choose honesty and courage from now on, even if it meant facing Mariah again, because despite everything, part of her still believed their story wasn't finished, a belief that was both hopeful and dangerous. And when Mariah finally stood in the doorway of Tessa's hospital room days later, having flown back without warning, the air between them crackled with everything left unsaid, their eyes locking in a moment that felt suspended in time, neither sure who should speak first, because apologies and accusations tangled painfully in their throats, and though words eventually came, raw, imperfect, and emotionally charged, they did not bring instant resolution, only clarity, as Mariah admitted she overheard the secret, admitted she'd left not just to survive but to hurt Tessa the way she'd been hurt, a confession that shattered any remaining illusions Tessa had about Mariah's silence being neutral or necessary, forcing both women to confront the uncomfortable truth that love does not excuse cruelty, even when it's born from pain. And as tears flowed and emotions surged, the future remained uncertain, because forgiveness, like trust, could not be demanded or rushed, especially with a baby on the way and Daniel inevitably bound to both of their lives forever, leaving Genoa City poised on the edge of a new chapter, one where choices made in fear would have to be reckoned with, and where the arrival of an innocent child might either heal old wounds or deepen them beyond repair, proving once again that in the young and the restless, love is never simple, secrets never stay buried, and every cruel decision leaves a legacy that must eventually be faced. As the weeks slipped by after that fragile hospital reunion, nothing settled the way anyone hoped it would, because while Mariah and Tessa had finally spoken the truth out loud, honesty did not magically erase the damage done, instead exposing how deep the wounds really were. And though Mariah remained in Genoa City longer than planned, hovering at the edges of Tessa's life, like a ghost of what they once were, she resisted the pull to reclaim her place too quickly, convinced that forgiveness, given too easily, would cheapen the pain she had endured, while Tessa, torn between relief that Mariah was back and fear that she would leave again, tried to prove through actions rather than words that she was committed to transparency, even as every shared glance carried the weight of unresolved history. And Daniel, painfully aware that his presence complicated everything, attempted to step back emotionally while remaining involved as a father, a balance that proved nearly impossible when labor fears intensified and doctor visits became more frequent, binding the three of them together in an uneasy orbit that Genoa City watched with barely concealed fascination, especially as Phyllis continued to stir the pot, suggesting in hushed tones that Mariah's return was less about love and more about control. Comments that ignited Mariah's temper and forced her to confront the uncomfortable question of whether part of her really did want to reassert her place simply because someone else had filled it. And as tensions escalated, the inevitable explosion came during a small, intimate baby shower Sharon organized in a last-ditch attempt to create peace, a gathering meant to celebrate new life that instead laid bare every fracture, because when Daniel made an offhand remark about being there from day one, Mariah snapped, accusing him of rewriting the narrative to make himself the hero while ignoring the wreckage left behind, and Tessa, overwhelmed and exhausted, broke down in tears, begging them both to stop turning her pregnancy into a battlefield, a plea that silenced the room and forced everyone to confront how far things had spiraled. Yet even in that moment of clarity, resolution remained elusive, because the arrival of the baby loomed like an approaching storm, promising either redemption or total collapse. And when labor finally began in the early hours of a rain-soaked night, panic rippled through Genoa City as calls were made and alliances temporarily set aside, Mariah arriving at the hospital first, soaked and breathless, taking Tessa's hand without hesitation as contractions tore through her, a silent declaration that no matter how broken they were, she would not abandon her again, while Daniel followed soon after, guilt and determination etched into his face as he took his place on the other side of the bed, creating a tableau no one could have predicted months earlier. And as hours dragged on and fear mounted with every complication, truths surfaced in raw, unguarded confessions, Mariah admitting she was terrified of loving the baby because loving them meant accepting the past, and Tessa admitting she didn't know how to forgive herself for the pain she caused, while Daniel, stripped of bravado, confessed that stepping up as a father terrified him as much as it gave him purpose. And when the baby's cry finally pierced the tension, the sound cracked something open in all of them, collapsing anger into awe as a new life entered the world, fragile and innocent and utterly unaware of the chaos that preceded them, and as Tessa held her child for the first time, tears streaming freely, she looked at Mariah with a question in her eyes that words could not carry, a question about whether there was still room in her heart for both love and forgiveness. And